My ex-husband laughed when the judge gave me only a small apartment, but he didn't know it was worth millions. The sun bathed the luxurious living room in golden light as a woman carefully arranged fresh lilies in a crystal vase. Everything in her life seemed meticulously in place, married to a successful businessman, living in an elegant mansion, and enjoying a lifestyle that most could only dream of. For years, she had dedicated herself to supporting her husband's ambitions, standing by his side as he climbed the corporate ladder, believing they were a team. Every morning, she prepared his coffee just the way he liked it, ensured his suits were perfectly pressed, and attended every event, smiling proudly as he introduced her as the woman behind his success. It was a life that, from the outside, looked enviable, perfect even. But beneath the polished surface, small cracks had begun to appear. Lately, he had grown distant, coming home late without explanations, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he would quickly hide. Their once warm conversations had turned into brief, indifferent exchanges, and the affectionate glances they used to share had vanished. At first, she dismissed it as stress from work, telling herself that after so many years together, some distance was normal. But deep down, an uneasy feeling gnawed at her, an instinct she tried desperately to ignore. That evening, as she set the dining table for two, she glanced at the untouched plate across from hers. It had become a routine, waiting, calling, receiving vague excuses, and eventually eating alone. Just as she was about to clear the table, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway made her heart leap. She rushed to the door, forcing a smile, hoping for a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with. But when he entered, he barely acknowledged her, brushing past her with a distracted nod. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume lingered in the air as he walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart sinking with the unspoken truth she had been dreading. The tension between them grew more obvious with each passing day. He had stopped asking about her day, no longer noticing when she dressed up for him, nor did he bother pretending to care about the small rituals they had once shared. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, had turned cold and silent. Whenever she tried to initiate a conversation, he would dismiss her with vague answers, his eyes constantly drifting toward his phone. She convinced herself that confronting him outright would only push him further away. Instead, she buried herself in household projects, desperately trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But the reality was inescapable. His late nights became more frequent, his business trips more sudden, and his explanations increasingly inconsistent. One evening, as she sat alone in the dimly lit living room, she scrolled through social media absent-mindedly until something caught her eye. A tagged photo from a corporate event he had claimed to have skipped due to exhaustion. There he was, dressed in his best suit, standing beside a young, beautiful woman who leaned in too closely, her hand resting on his arm. The caption read, "Power couple of the night." A cold wave of realization hit her, followed by a sharp sting in her chest. The moment he walked in that night, she confronted him, holding up the phone with the picture on full display. He barely flinched, his expression unreadable. "It's just a business event," he said dismissively, snatching the phone from her hand. "You're being paranoid." But she wasn't. She knew what she had seen, and more importantly, she knew what she felt. Something had shifted irreversibly between them. She was no longer looking at the man she had loved for years. She was looking at a stranger. The final confirmation came at the company gala a week later. She hadn't planned to go, but something inside her told her she needed to be there. Dressed in a navy blue gown, she arrived at the venue, forcing a composed smile as she greeted familiar faces. But her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for only one person. It didn't take long. Across the ballroom, he stood at the bar, leaning in close to the same woman from the photo, his assistant. Their laughter was intimate, their whispers private, and when she playfully touched his tie, he made no effort to move away. Her heart pounded as she approached, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Just before she reached them, she stopped. A group of executives nearby were engaged in conversation, their voices low but audible. "I heard he's leaving his wife soon," one of them murmured. "Trading her in for the younger model." Laughter followed. She felt her stomach twist as humiliation burned through her. They weren't just speculating. They knew. This wasn't just an affair, it was an escape plan, and she had been the last to find out. She turned on her heel and left the gala without a word. When he came home that night, she was waiting for him. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. He didn't even pretend to be confused. With a cold smirk, he replied, "Long enough to realize I don't need you anymore." The finality in his words shattered something deep within her. The morning after the gala, she woke up to find divorce papers on the kitchen counter. No explanation, no conversation, just cold, legal documents spelling out the end of everything they had built together. He had already moved most of his things out, leaving behind only what he no longer needed. As she stared at the papers, the reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a calculated decision, planned long before she even suspected it. She refused to let him see her break. Summoning every ounce of dignity she had left, she met him at their lawyer's office. He sat across from her, looking completely at ease, tapping his pen against the desk as his expensive lawyer outlined the settlement. He was keeping their mansion, their cars, and nearly all of their assets. She would receive only a small apartment that had belonged to her grandmother, a property he had always mocked as worthless. "It's fair," he said casually, barely looking at her. "Fair?" The word echoed in her mind as she clenched her fists under the table. He had taken everything, her trust, her marriage, her home, and now, he had the audacity to act as though she should be grateful for whatever scraps he threw her way. She signed the papers with a steady hand, refusing to let him see the pain behind her eyes. As she stood to leave, he leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Enjoy your tiny apartment," he said mockingly. "It's all you're worth." The move to the apartment felt like a descent into an unfamiliar world. She had spent years surrounded by luxury, only to find herself in a place that felt impossibly small, with creaky wooden floors and outdated furnishings. But it wasn't the apartment itself that broke her, it was the knowledge of how easily he had discarded her. She had given years of her life to a man who had seen her as nothing more than a replaceable fixture in his life. Sitting on the floor among unpacked boxes, she allowed herself a moment of grief. Silent tears streamed down her face as she hugged an old photograph of them, back when they were young, when love had felt real. But then, something inside her shifted. She had been humiliated, abandoned, and treated like she was worthless. But was she? No. She refused to believe that her worth was tied to a man who had never truly valued her. As she began organizing her belongings, she found a stack of old letters tucked away in a drawer. They were from her grandmother, written years ago before she had passed. As she unfolded the first letter, her breath caught in her throat. The words hinted at something she had never known, a secret about this very apartment. Her heart raced. Could it be possible that this place, the one her ex-husband had mocked so cruelly, was worth far more than anyone realized? The courtroom was a battlefield, and she quickly realized she was outnumbered. Her ex-husband's legal team, a group of polished, intimidating attorneys, presented their case with confidence, painting him as the sole provider of their marriage and portraying her as a woman who had contributed nothing. Every moment of her life as a supportive wife was twisted against her, her years spent managing their home, hosting events for his career, and ensuring his success were reduced to insignificance. Her own lawyer tried to argue otherwise, but the judge, unimpressed, seemed inclined to favor her ex-husband, who sat smugly in his chair, feigning indifference. When the final ruling was announced, her stomach twisted. He would keep everything, the house, the luxury cars, the vacation properties, everything they had built together. She was left with nothing except for a small, aging apartment that had belonged to her grandmother. A murmur ran through the courtroom as her ex-husband smirked, leaning back in his chair. The humiliation was suffocating. As she walked out, he didn't miss his chance to whisper, "Guess that's all you were worth." Laughter followed him as he walked away, his young assistant clutching his arm, already celebrating his victory. The apartment was a far cry from the mansion she once called home. It smelled of dust and memories long forgotten, the walls lined with old photographs of her grandmother's life. Sitting on the worn-out couch, she let the weight of everything settle in. The man she had loved had stripped her of everything, leaving her with what he assumed was worthless. The legal battle hadn't just taken her material possessions, it had publicly humiliated her, reducing her value in front of the world. But as she took a deep breath, she realized something profound. The mansion, the cars, the jewelry, none of it had truly belonged to her. It had always been his, a part of his world. But this apartment? This was hers. She wandered through the small rooms, running her fingers over the old furniture, remembering childhood visits when her grandmother would tell her stories late into the night. Her grandmother had always spoken of this place with love, but there was something more, something she had hinted at in those letters. Digging through drawers, she found an envelope, yellowed with time, addressed to her. As she carefully unfolded the letter, her heart pounded. The words inside hinted at a truth she had never known: this apartment, and more importantly, the land it sat on, held a secret that no one had ever uncovered. News of her downfall spread quickly. Once, she had been the elegant wife of a wealthy businessman, respected in their social circles. Now, she was nothing more than a pitiful divorcee, stripped of everything, left to live in a rundown apartment. The whispers followed her wherever she went. Old acquaintances pretended not to see her in public, and those who once envied her now took satisfaction in her downfall. At the grocery store, she overheard two women murmuring, she had it all and lost it overnight. At a cafe, an old friend awkwardly changed the subject when someone mentioned her ex-husband's engagement to his assistant. The worst came when she ran into him by chance at a restaurant. He was seated at a lavish table, his new fiancée on his arm, surrounded by colleagues. When he saw her, his expression turned smug. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he chuckled, "Enjoying your tiny apartment? Must be quite the downgrade." Laughter erupted around him, and her cheeks burned with shame. She gritted her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she simply turned and walked away. But inside, something was changing. The humiliation she had endured was fueling something deeper, a quiet determination that she had never felt before. The weight of everything pressed down on her in the solitude of the small apartment. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything. Had she truly wasted years of her life on a man who never valued her? How had she become so dependent on a life that was never truly hers? Her self-worth had been tied to him for so long that, now without him, she felt lost. The voices of those who pitied or mocked her echoed in her mind, but none hurt more than her own doubts. Would she ever rebuild herself? Would she ever escape the shadow of what he had done to her? But as she sifted through the remnants of her grandmother's past, something shifted. The letter she had found continued to call to her. It spoke of something valuable hidden within the apartment, something overlooked for decades. Desperation turned to curiosity, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of purpose. If this apartment was all she had left, then she would uncover every secret it held. She refused to believe that fate had left her here to suffer. There had to be more to the story. Determined to uncover the truth, she began searching through every inch of the apartment. Every drawer, every cabinet, every old book was examined with careful hands. Days turned into nights as she pieced together old documents, finding small hints her grandmother had left behind. Then, one evening, she stumbled upon an old box hidden beneath the wooden floorboards of the bedroom. Her heart pounded as she lifted it, the dust swirling in the dim light. Inside, she found a collection of aged papers, property records dating back decades. Her hands trembled as she scanned the documents, her breath catching at what she saw. The land her grandmother's apartment was built on was no ordinary property. It had been part of a historical development project that had long been forgotten until now. According to these records, the city had marked this land for a massive redevelopment plan, one that would make its value skyrocket overnight. Her ex-husband, in his greed and arrogance, had assumed she had been left with nothing. But he had been wrong. Very wrong. The tiny, worthless apartment he had laughed at was sitting on a fortune, and he had no idea. As she closed the box, a slow, determined smile spread across her face. The tables were about to turn. The documents in the box became her obsession. She spent hours poring over the faded papers, tracing the history of the land her grandmother had once cherished. The records showed that decades ago, a city expansion project had been proposed but later abandoned. However, recent government filings hinted at something new, a redevelopment plan that had quietly been reproved. If these documents were correct, the land beneath her tiny apartment was about to become one of the most sought-after properties in the city. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Determined to confirm what she had found, she reached out to an old friend, a real estate analyst. Over coffee, she carefully laid out the evidence, watching as his skeptical expression turned into shock. "If this is accurate," he murmured, flipping through the papers, "developers would fight over this land." He looked up, his eyes sharp. "And right now, you're sitting on something worth millions." The words echoed in her mind. The same property her ex-husband had mocked and discarded as worthless was actually her greatest asset. She had been humiliated, belittled, and cast aside, but fate had delivered a poetic twist. Determined to dig deeper, she made her way to City Hall, the weight of possibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. The records department was a labyrinth of bureaucracy, but after persistent questioning, she managed to meet with a city official who hesitantly pulled up the latest zoning plans. As the screen flickered to life, she could barely breathe. The area surrounding her apartment was marked for high-value commercial redevelopment, a classification that meant one thing: massive investor interest. Developers were already negotiating with the city, waiting for the right moment to secure properties in the area. As she processed the information, the official gave her a knowing glance. "If I were you," he said, lowering his voice, "I'd hold on to that place. You have no idea how much power you're about to have." Power. A word she had never associated with herself. For so long, she had been at the mercy of others, her husband, the legal system, society's judgment. Now, for the first time, she held the upper hand. She left City Hall with her head held high. Her ex-husband thought he had won. But he had no idea how wrong he was. That night, she sat at her small dining table, staring at the city plans. Her ex-husband had walked away with all their wealth, their mansion, their luxurious lifestyle, while she had been left with an apartment he had deemed worthless. But in reality, the land beneath her feet was worth more than everything he had taken from her combined. A slow, disbelieving laugh escaped her lips. This wasn't just justice, it was a twist of fate so perfect that it almost felt surreal. The next morning, her phone rang. It was her real estate friend again, his voice filled with excitement. "I ran a valuation estimate based on recent sales in the district," he said breathlessly. "If you sell now, you could easily get over $10 million. $10 million. She gripped the phone, the weight of the revelation making her dizzy. Her ex-husband had laughed at her in court, humiliated her in public, believing he had stripped her of everything. But he had unknowingly given her something that would make her wealthier than she had ever imagined. And she hadn't even begun to explore her options. The offers came flooding in faster than she could process. Real estate developers, corporate investors, and even international firms were reaching out, each trying to outbid the last. Her email inbox was filled with eye-watering numbers, and her phone didn't stop ringing. Each time she saw a new offer, her mind went back to that moment in court, her ex-husband's smug smirk as the judge handed her the apartment. If only he knew. But she wasn't about to settle for a quick payout. She had spent years watching her husband handle business deals, and now it was her turn to play the game. Instead of selling immediately, she consulted a financial advisor. "You could cash out now and walk away with millions," he explained. "Or you could develop it yourself. Turn it into a commercial complex, rental property, something that generates revenue for years to come." The thought of being more than just a recipient of a lucky break thrilled her. She wanted more than just revenge, she wanted to build something for herself, something her ex-husband would regret underestimating. The apartment, the land, her future, it was all in her hands now. She remained quiet about her newfound fortune, letting the world believe she was still struggling. Her ex-husband and his fiancée had already moved on, flaunting their lavish lifestyle while assuming she was drowning in misery. But while they celebrated their so-called victory, she was carefully constructing her next move. She met with architects, investors, and business strategists, mapping out a plan to transform the tiny apartment into a high-end commercial development. Every decision she made was deliberate, every detail designed to secure not just wealth, but long-term power. The irony was almost too perfect. Her ex-husband, so certain that she had been left with nothing, had unknowingly gifted her an empire. And he still had no idea. As she signed the first set of official development papers, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. He had once told her she was worthless. Soon, he would see just how wrong he had been. The calls from investors became relentless. Every day, new proposals arrived, some offering immediate cash deals, others promising partnerships in exchange for a stake in the land. Some tried to downplay its value, hoping she would accept a lower offer, assuming she was still desperate. But she was no longer the naive woman who once depended on someone else to make decisions for her. She sat through negotiations with a calm, calculating demeanor, countering every offer with hard facts and refusing to be rushed. The same men who once dismissed her were now competing for her attention. She was no longer the woman left behind in court, no longer the pitiful ex-wife in the background. With each meeting, she felt herself transform. For years, she had watched her husband handle business with ruthless efficiency. Now, she was doing the same, but this time for herself. The irony was poetic. He had walked away believing she was nothing without him, yet here she was, commanding the room, determining the fate of a multi-million-dollar project. And still, he had no idea. Despite the overwhelming offers, she knew she needed to be smart. Selling now would make her instantly wealthy, but what if she could turn this opportunity into something even bigger? She met with a financial strategist who laid out two paths, cashing out or developing the land herself. If you sell, you'll be rich, he explained. But if you invest, you'll build something that pays you for a lifetime. The idea of creating her own empire, rather than just inheriting one, sent a thrill through her. She had spent too long being controlled by others, it was time to take control of her own destiny. She spent days reviewing case studies, learning about urban development, and analyzing risks. Every decision had weight now, and she refused to make the wrong one. Late at night, she sat in the apartment that had once felt like her downfall, now realizing it was the foundation of her future. The choice was clear, she wouldn't sell. She would build. The same apartment her ex-husband had mocked would soon stand as a testament to everything she had overcome. With her decision made, she wasted no time. She partnered with a top architectural firm to draft blueprints for a modern commercial complex. The plans included luxury office spaces, retail stores, and high-end apartments, a development that would redefine the entire district. Investors lined up eager to be part of the project, and banks offered financing on terms that made success inevitable. For the first time in her life, she wasn't relying on someone else's wealth. She was creating her own. The process was intense, filled with long nights, endless meetings, and difficult decisions. But every moment was worth it. She no longer felt the sting of her past humiliation. Instead, she felt power, real, undeniable power. She wasn't just rebuilding her life, she was elevating it beyond anything she had ever imagined. The woman who had once been discarded was now the one shaping the future of an entire district. And soon, the world, including her ex-husband, would see just how much she had changed. The groundbreaking ceremony was a moment of triumph. Cameras flashed as city officials and investors gathered to celebrate the project that was about to transform the area. She stood at the front, her name now associated with power and vision. The apartment that had once been seen as a punishment was now the cornerstone of something extraordinary. As she spoke to reporters, she kept her answers professional, never mentioning her past, never addressing the man who had tried to destroy her. She didn't need to. Her success spoke louder than any revenge could. Behind closed doors, whispers of her rise reached unexpected ears. Former acquaintances who had once pitted her now scrambled to reconnect, suddenly remembering their past friendship. Businessmen who had once dismissed her now sought her advice. And then, finally, her ex-husband's name surfaced. Word had spread to him. He had heard about the project, about her success. And soon, he would learn the final, cruel twist. His own company's headquarters were about to be directly impacted by her development. The news of her project spread like wildfire. The same people who had once laughed at her were now watching in awe as she turned her worthless apartment into one of the most valuable developments in the city. High-end clients were already lining up for leasing opportunities, and major corporations were eager to establish themselves in the new district. Among those affected was her ex-husband's firm, which occupied a building neighboring her construction site. His company was now in direct competition with her development, a fact he was about to realize in the most humiliating way possible. One evening, she received a text from an old acquaintance. "Your ex-husband looked sick when he heard your name tied to the project. He thought you disappeared, but now you own half the district." She read the message slowly, letting it sink in. This wasn't just success. This was justice. He had laughed at her when she walked out of court. Soon, he would realize that the woman he had dismissed had become his greatest rival. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Her ex-husband prided himself on being in control, but the news of her sudden rise shook him to the core. At first, he dismissed the rumors, refusing to believe that the woman he had discarded could have achieved something so significant. But when his business partners mentioned the redevelopment project, her project, he felt a wave of unease. He brushed it off with a forced laugh, claiming she had simply gotten lucky. Yet, deep down, a nagging fear grew. The same apartment he had mocked was now at the center of a district that would redefine the city's real estate market. His confidence cracked further when he realized just how deeply her project would impact him. His company's headquarters, once a prime location, was now overshadowed by her modern commercial complex. Clients who had once been loyal to him were considering moving into her development, lured by better deals and a more prestigious address. Panic set in. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. And the worst part? She hadn't even acknowledged him. She had succeeded without mentioning his name, as if he were irrelevant. His troubles escalated quickly. The market had shifted, and while he had been busy celebrating his victory over her, he had neglected key financial decisions. Now, with her development rising, investors were pulling back from his company, questioning whether he could keep up with the changing landscape. Even his most trusted partners hesitated, wary of betting against a project that had the entire city buzzing. The irony was suffocating. He had always been the one in control, the one with power. But now, she was the force shaping the city's future. His new fiancée, the woman he had so proudly chosen over his ex-wife, was growing restless. She had enjoyed the luxury of being with a powerful man, but with his business faltering, she began to distance herself. Arguments became frequent, her once adoring glances turning into frustrated glares. She wasn't interested in struggling alongside him. She had been drawn to success, and now, she was questioning whether she had bet on the wrong person. The cracks in his perfect life were widening, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Desperation drove him to do something he never imagined. He reached out to his ex-wife. It started with a casual message, pretending to check in, but she ignored it. Then came a phone call, which went straight to voicemail. Finally, he showed up at her office unannounced, standing in the reception area of the very building he had once mocked her for owning. When she stepped into the lobby, she barely glanced at him before walking past. The humiliation was unbearable. He had expected bitterness, maybe even anger, but instead, she treated him as if he were invisible. Forcing a smile, he followed her into a private meeting room, trying to reclaim his old confidence. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice carefully measured. "Maybe we could talk? Maybe we don't have to be enemies." He waited for her reaction, hoping to see some flicker of the woman who had once loved him, who had once bent over backward to make him happy. But she only tilted her head, considering him like a stranger. "We're not enemies," she finally said. "We're nothing." With that, she stood, leaving him alone with the weight of his own regret. The conversation lingered in his mind long after she had walked away. He had expected resistance, even resentment, but her indifference was far worse. She had moved on, not just emotionally but in every way that mattered. And while he was desperately trying to salvage his crumbling business, she was thriving. His attempts to downplay her success had failed. She wasn't a lucky woman who had stumbled into wealth, she was a calculated, strategic force who had built something greater than he had ever imagined. Days later, a business proposal landed on his desk, one that required leasing office space in her development. It was a bitter pill to swallow. His company's survival depended on securing prime real estate, and the best available location was in her complex. Signing that contract would mean acknowledging that she had surpassed him, that he now had to operate under her shadow. The decision tormented him, but deep down, he knew the truth: he had no other choice. The day he signed the lease was the lowest point of his career. Sitting across from her in the conference room, he barely recognized the woman he had once belittled. She exuded confidence, her presence commanding the respect of every executive in the room. As she flipped through the contract, she didn't rush, she took her time, savoring the moment. Then, with a composed smile, she slid the papers back to him. "Welcome to my building," she said. The words stung more than any insult ever could. As he left the meeting, reality sank in. He had laughed at her when the judge handed her that small apartment, mocking her downfall. But fate had its own sense of justice. Now, the same woman he had discarded owned the very ground beneath his feet. And the worst part? She hadn't done it for revenge. She had done it for herself. He was just an afterthought, a lesson in what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. The day her ex-husband moved into her building was one she would never forget. His company had no choice but to lease office space in her commercial complex, a decision that must have tasted like ash in his mouth. He walked through the entrance, head held stiffly, surrounded by his team. The moment their eyes met, he hesitated. The man who had once laughed at her misfortune now stood before her, forced to acknowledge that he was beneath her in every sense. She greeted him with a composed smile, offering nothing but professionalism. As she escorted him through the building, pointing out the premium features of the offices, he could barely meet her gaze. At the end of the tour, she slid the lease agreement across the table. "This is business," she said coolly. "I assume you have no objections." He swallowed hard, knowing he had none. He signed the contract, his hands trembling slightly, and in that moment, he knew she had won. As weeks passed, the reality of his downfall became more evident. Employees whispered about how ironic it was that their boss now worked from a building owned by the woman he had once discarded. Some even speculated that he was regretting everything, though he was too proud to admit it. His fiancée, once the glamorous young assistant he had left his wife for, was no longer impressed. The man she had chosen was struggling, while the woman he had abandoned was thriving. Meanwhile, she barely thought of him. Her life was filled with meetings, expansion plans, and new opportunities. What once had been a painful betrayal had become nothing more than a distant memory. She had built herself into someone stronger, someone independent, someone untouchable. He had assumed she would crumble, that she would spend years bitter and broken. Instead, she had risen so high that he could barely reach her shadow. The grand opening of her development was a city-wide event. Investors, city officials, and business leaders attended, celebrating the launch of the district's most anticipated commercial space. She stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with confidence, reflecting on how far she had come. This moment was hers. Not a gift from fate, not a lucky break, but the result of her own resilience and determination. Among the guests, she spotted a familiar face, her ex-husband, standing at the back, watching with an unreadable expression. Maybe he had come to witness her triumph, or perhaps he had come to understand what he had lost. Either way, it didn't matter. As she stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with major investors and executives, she realized something. His opinion, his presence, his regrets, they no longer had any hold over her. Years later, their paths crossed once more. She was walking through the bustling commercial district she had built, overseeing another new project, when she saw him sitting alone at a cafe. He looked different, tired, aged beyond his years. His once flawless suit was slightly wrinkled, his posture slouched. He no longer carried the arrogance that once defined him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered between them. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but she simply gave him a polite nod and walked away. There was nothing left to discuss. No revenge to take, no pain to hold on to. She had moved on, while he was left to sit in the ruins of his own decisions. As she disappeared into the towering skyscraper bearing her company's name, he finally understood she had never needed him. She stood on the rooftop of her latest development, looking out at the city skyline. The same city where she had once been humiliated and discarded was now the place where she reigned. The past no longer haunted her, it had shaped her, strengthened her, and led her here. Every moment of pain had only fueled her determination, and now, she had built a life greater than she had ever imagined. Her ex-husband had once believed he had one. He had laughed in court, confident that she had been left with nothing. But fate had a way of correcting injustices. In the end, the woman he had underestimated had become someone untouchable. And he had become nothing more than a lesson in what happens when you bet against the wrong person.